The winter of 1869 came down hard on the Great Plains. Snow buried the tall grass and turned the rivers into thick, silent glass. The Lakota Sioux camps sat low against the earth, their smoke rising in thin gray threads toward a pale sky. It was a time when people stayed close to their fires, when stories were told and children listened with wide, hungry eyes. It was not a time when a man should have to make the kind of decision that could burn everything he had ever built. Chief Red Cloud sat inside his lodge that night, his face carved by years of war and weather, his eyes holding the particular stillness of a man who had seen too much to be easily frightened. He had led his people through one of the most remarkable military campaigns the American West had ever witnessed. Red Cloud's War, they would one day call it, the only war in American history where the United States government signed a treaty on the terms of the native side. He had forced the army to abandon its forts along the Bozeman Trail. He had stood at the negotiating table and refused to move. He was not a man who bet. And yet, as the messenger stepped into his lodge that night, something behind his eyes shifted in a way it rarely did. Something close to worry. Her name was Fanny Kelly. She was 20-year-old, a young white woman from Geneva, New York, who had been traveling west with her husband Josiah and a small group of settlers in the summer of 1864. The wagon train had crossed into the Dakota Territory with the kind of hopeful ignorance that sent so many families west in those years. They were heading toward Idaho, chasing the promise of land and a new life. What they found instead was a Oglala Sioux raiding party on the banks of the Little Box Elder Creek in present-day Wyoming. The attack was swift and brutal. Several members of the wagon party were killed. Fanny's husband managed to escape on horseback, believing his wife was dead. But Fanny was not dead. She had been taken. 4 months, she moved through the hands of different Sioux bands, traded, threatened, kept alive by a mixture of her own fierce will and the complicated politics of captivity on the plains. She had tried to escape twice. Both times she was caught. She had watched the prairie stretch out endlessly in every direction and understood, with terrible clarity, that running was not going to save her. Only the right man making the right choice could do that. By late 1864, word of Fanny Kelly's captivity had traveled far. The U.S. Army knew she was alive. The newspapers back east had printed her story, though they had gotten most of the details wrong, as newspapers often did. To the Army she was a symbol. A white woman in the hands of native warriors was exactly the kind of story that could inflame public opinion, loosen congressional purse strings, and justify military action on the plains. There were officers who wanted to move against the Sioux camps immediately. There were men in uniform who saw her captivity not as a tragedy to be resolved quietly, but as a political opportunity to be exploited loudly. Red Cloud understood all of this. He was not naive about the way the white government worked, about how a single incident could be twisted into a justification for war. He had spent years reading the signals, watching the patterns, measuring the distance between what the Army said and what it actually did. He knew that Fanny Kelly's presence in the camps was a powder keg. He knew that the wrong move, or no move at all, could bring soldiers pouring across the treaty lines with rifles and artillery and the full terrible weight of the United States military behind them. He also knew something else. He knew that a man was only worth the hardest decision he ever made. Not the easy ones. Not the ones where the right answer was obvious and the cost was low. The ones where everything you had built was sitting on the table, where your people's lives hung in the balance, and you still had to choose what was right over what was safe. That was the decision sitting in front of him now. And Red Cloud, who had never run from anything in his life, looked straight at it. To understand what Red Cloud was risking, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1864. The Civil War was grinding toward its bloody end in the east, and out on the Great Plains, a different kind of war was quietly building momentum. The United States government had a policy, though it was rarely stated so plainly. The native tribes of the West would either be moved onto reservations or they would be destroyed. The military language was softer than that, wrapped in words like pacification and civilization, but the meaning underneath was hard and cold and final. The Sioux had been watching this policy advance westward for years. They had seen what happened to other tribes. The broken treaties, the shrinking land, the hungry winters on reservation ground that grew worse with every passing season. Red Cloud had fought to hold the line, and for a time he had succeeded. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had given the Lakota the Black Hills and a vast swath of land in the Dakotas. It had been a genuine victory, a moment when diplomacy and military strength had combined to produce something real. But the ink on that treaty was still fresh, and there were men in Washington and men wearing blue coats on the plains who were already looking for reasons to rewrite it. Fanny Kelly, sitting in a mini Kanju Sioux camp in late 1864, was exactly the kind of reason they were looking for. She had been passed between camps more than half a dozen times by now. She had been given a Sioux name, Winona, meaning firstborn daughter. She had learned fragments of the language, enough to understand snatches of conversation, enough to know that her fate was not settled. Some in the camps argued she was worth keeping as a bargaining tool. Others wanted to use her to extract weapons and supplies from the army. A few wanted her gone entirely, fearing exactly what Red Cloud feared, that her presence was a fire that kept drawing attention, kept bringing soldiers closer, kept making the camps a target. She was strong, this woman. The Lakota had expected her to break as some captives did, collapsing into grief or silence or a kind of hollow compliance. Fanny Kelly did none of those things. She grieved, yes, deeply and privately, especially for her adopted daughter Mary, a young girl who had been in the wagon party and had been killed trying to escape in the early weeks of the captivity. That loss had carved something out of Fanny that never fully grew back. But grief had not made her passive. She wrote secret letters, tucking them into the dirt near army trails, hoping soldiers would find them. She memorized faces, names, the layout of camps. She survived with a kind of quiet ferocity that impressed even the women who guarded her. Red Cloud heard these things. He had a network of information that stretched across hundreds of miles of plains, fed by traders, runners, and the kind of informal intelligence that tribal leaders had always depended on. He knew who Fanny Kelly was. He knew what she had endured. And he knew that the longer she remained in the camps, the more dangerous the situation became for everyone. Here was the problem. He did not hold her. She was in Minnie Conju hands, not Oglala hands. To negotiate for her release was to step into another band's affairs, which was politically sensitive in the same way that one nation reaching into another's domestic matters is always sensitive. He could not simply demand she be handed over. He could not send his warriors to take her. Either move would shatter the fragile alliances that held the Sioux coalition together, alliances that were already strained by different visions of how to deal with the growing white presence. And there was a deeper problem still. If he went to the army to negotiate her return, he would be talking to the very institution that wanted his land. He would be giving the military a reason to enter his territory, to establish contact, to position soldiers closer to Lakota camps. Every negotiation had a cost beyond the obvious one. Every conversation with the army was a door that, once opened, was very hard to close again. Red Cloud sat with this problem the way a man sits with a stone in his hand, feeling its weight, measuring its edges, deciding what to do with it. He prayed. He sought the counsel of his advisors. He listened to the voices of older men who had navigated impossible situations before him. And slowly, painfully, a plan began to take shape. It was not a safe plan. There was no safe plan. But it was the right one, and for Red Cloud, in the end, that had always been enough. Red Cloud moved in December 1864, when the snow was deep and the army forts were cold and understaffed. The timing was deliberate. A chief who had spent his adult life studying military strategy understood that winter was the season of reduced patrols, frozen supply lines, and officers too focused on staying warm to launch major offensives. If he was going to make a move, he wanted the smallest possible audience, the fewest possible triggers. He sent runners first, quiet, trusted men who knew how to travel unseen across the plains. They carried no weapons, only words. The message was careful and precise. Red Cloud wanted to talk, not fight. He had information about the white woman. He wanted to arrange a meeting at Fort Laramie, on neutral ground, in daylight, with witnesses on both sides. He was not surrendering. He was not asking for anything. He was offering a transaction, and he wanted it conducted like one, with dignity on both sides of the table. The response from the army was cautious. There were officers at Fort Laramie who trusted Red Cloud, who had dealt with him before and understood that his word meant something. There were others who saw the offer as a trap, or worse, as weakness, a sign that military pressure was working, that more pressure might yield more results. The debate inside the fort's walls mirrored the debate happening in Washington, where the question of how to handle the Plains tribes was being argued with the same combination of idealism, greed, and genuine confusion that characterized most American Indian policy of the era. In the end, the army agreed to talk. The meeting was set. Red Cloud arrived at Fort Laramie with a delegation of Oglala warriors, enough men to make clear that he came with strength, not desperation. He wore no war paint. His bearing was the bearing of a man who had already decided he was in the right and had stopped worrying about whether anyone else agreed. The soldiers who watched him ride and saw a man who moved as though the ground belonged to him, because in his understanding of the world, it did. The negotiations were tense. There were translators whose fluency was imperfect, which meant that nuance was constantly being lost and misread on both sides. Red Cloud spoke plainly. He had influence over the mini-Kanju camp where Fanny Kelly was held. He could use that influence to secure her release. But he needed the army to understand several things clearly. This was not an act of submission. It was not an acknowledgement of the army's authority over Lakota affairs. It was a gesture made in the interest of peace, and it came with an expectation that the army would honor the existing treaties and not interpret this goodwill as an invitation to push further into Sioux territory. The army representatives listened. Some nodded. Some took notes. Some of them, Red Cloud knew, were not listening at all. They were calculating, measuring him, looking for advantages. That was the nature of these conversations. You spoke to the man in front of you and hoped that the men behind him were reasonable. You never knew for certain. What Red Cloud did not know, could not have known, was that even as these talks were happening, the army's attitude toward the Plains tribes was hardening in a way that would soon become catastrophic. The Sand Creek Massacre, where Colorado militia had attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village just weeks before and killed over 150 people, mostly women, children, and elderly, was already reshaping the politics of the region in dark and terrible ways. The massacre had horrified some and emboldened others. It was the kind of event that made men on both sides of the cultural divide more afraid, more angry, and more willing to reach for violence as a solution. Red Cloud was walking a wire stretched over an abyss, and he could not see how far down it went. He pushed forward anyway. He sent word to the mini-Kanju camp, not a demand because demands created resistance, but a careful, politically weighted request, backed by his reputation and his relationships, wrapped in the language of collective Sioux interest. He argued that Fanny Kelly was a liability. He argued that releasing her was the smart move, the strategic move, the move that would take one justification for army aggression off the table. He made the case patiently, repeatedly, in the way that true leadership often works, not through force but through the slow accumulation of persuasion. And then he waited. The transfer happened on December 9, 1864, at Fort Sully in the Dakota Territory. Fanny Kelly walked out of the cold and into the light of the fort, and the soldiers who saw her said later that she looked like a woman who had carried something unbearable for a very long time and had learned to walk with it anyway. She was thin. Her face showed the hard weather of 5 months on the plains. But her eyes were clear. She was alive and she was present, and she carried herself with a composure that silenced the room. The soldiers who received her did not fully understand what it had taken to bring her there. They saw a rescued woman. They did not see the web of negotiations, the political risks, the careful maneuvering across tribal lines, the long personal gamble that Red Cloud had placed on her behalf. Military reports would note the transfer tersely. A woman returned, a chief's cooperation acknowledged. The full weight of what had happened would take years for historians to excavate. Fanny Kelly understood it better than anyone. In the months she had spent among the Sioux, she had developed something complicated and genuine, not approval of her captivity, never that, but a real understanding of the people who had held her. She had seen their children, their grief, their humor, their dignity. She had seen the way they spoke about the land as though it were alive and listening. She had seen the fear underneath the strength, the knowledge that something enormous and unstoppable was coming for everything they had. She would later write a memoir, published in 1871 entitled Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians. It would become one of the most widely read captivity narratives of the era. In it, she described her experiences with honesty that surprised many of her readers, who expected either pure horror or pure sentimentality and got something more truthful and more complicated than either. She wrote about Red Cloud. She wrote about his role in her release. She acknowledged, plainly and without minimizing what she had suffered, that a man had risked something enormous to bring her home. Back in the Lakota camps, the reaction to Fanny Kelly's release was mixed. Some warriors felt that Red Cloud had given something away without getting enough in return. They had been right to worry. The army's gratitude was real but shallow. It lasted exactly as long as the next political crisis, which was not long. The treaties that Red Cloud had fought for in Fanny Kelly's release had seemed to reinforce were already being eroded by the relentless pressure of westward expansion, by gold hunger, by the railroads pushing their iron lines deeper into the heart of the continent. But that winter, in that moment, something important had happened. A man with every reason to say no had said yes. A man who stood at the center of one of the most explosive conflicts in American history had chosen the harder, quieter, more human path. He had looked at the machinery of war grinding toward him and decided that one woman's life was worth the risk of standing in front of it. Red Cloud returned to his people and said nothing dramatic about what he had done. That was not his way. He had not done it for stories or for the kind of credit that gets written into history books. He had done it because it was right, because peace, even an uncertain, threatened, temporary peace, was worth more than the satisfaction of holding a hostage as a shield. He had done it because he was a chief, and a chief's first responsibility was to see the full landscape of consequences, not just the ones that were obvious and immediate. The woman he had saved went east. She rebuilt her life with a tenacity that matched the courage she had shown on the plains. She testified before Congress about her captivity. She fought, successfully, for compensation that the government had promised and then tried not to pay. She raised a family. She grew old. And she never forgot the man who had made all of it possible. There is a particular kind of courage that history tends to overlook. It is not the courage of the battlefield, where valor is visible and witnesses are plentiful. It is not the courage of the speech or the manifesto, where words become monuments and monuments become memory. It is the courage of the private decision, made in a cold lodge in the middle of winter, with no audience and no guarantee and every imaginable reason to choose differently. Red Cloud made that kind of decision in the winter of 1864, and the world mostly moved on without noticing. The years that followed were brutal. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 sent a flood of prospectors into the heart of Lakota territory, in direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty that Red Cloud had fought so hard to secure. The Army, which had accepted Fanny Kelly's release as an act of goodwill, now moved to enforce a policy of total dispossession. The Great Sioux War of 1876 followed, culminating in the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer's forces were defeated by a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Red Cloud did not fight in that battle. He had moved toward a more diplomatic path by then, but the war was the inevitable result of everything he had tried to prevent. The Black Hills were seized anyway. The treaties were broken. The reservations shrank and then shrank again. Red Cloud spent the rest of his long life. He died in 1909 at approximately 88 years old, fighting with words and negotiations and legal challenges instead of weapons. He traveled to Washington multiple times to argue for his people's rights. He met with presidents. He spoke to reporters and lawyers and policy makers. He lost most of those fights not because his arguments were weak, but because the forces arrayed against him were too large, too wealthy, and too determined to stop. And yet there is something in that Winter Act of 1864 that refuses to be fully buried by the tragedies that followed it. Because history is not only made of the big movements and the sweeping forces. It is also made of the individual moments when a person looks at a situation and decides to be larger than the circumstances pressing down on them. Red Cloud did not have to help Fanny Kelly. Let that sit for a moment. She was a captive of another band, not his problem by any tribal accounting of responsibility. The political risks of negotiating her release were severe. The army he was negotiating with had already shown, at Sand Creek and a dozen smaller incidents, that it did not treat native lives with the care or respect it expected for its own people. He was extending goodwill to an institution that had made very clear it would not reliably extend goodwill in return. He did it anyway. He did it because he understood something about the long game of survival, that a people's dignity is not only defended with weapons. It is defended with every act that demonstrates their humanity, their moral seriousness, their refusal to become what their enemies accuse them of being. By securing Fanny Kelly's release, Red Cloud was making an argument, in the most concrete way possible, about the kind of people the Lakota were. He was saying, we are not what your newspapers say we are. We are not savages. We are people who keep their word, who weigh consequences, who choose peace when we can and fight only when we must. History did not reward him adequately for that argument. It rarely does in the short term. But the argument itself has lasted. Scholars who study this period come back to that December transfer again and again, not just as a footnote in Fanny Kelly's story, but as a window into something essential about Red Cloud's character and about the tragedy of what was lost when American expansion chose force over negotiation. Again and again and again. Fanny Kelly lived until 1904. In her later years she gave interviews and talks about her captivity, and she consistently pushed back against the simplistic narrative that framed her story as a tale of savage captors and innocent victim. The reality had been more human than that, she said. The people who had held her had been people, flawed, frightened, proud, and capable of both cruelty and extraordinary kindness. And the man who had brought her home had been one of the finest human beings she had ever encountered, regardless of the vast cultural distance between them. Red Cloud. A man who risked war to save one woman. Not because she was powerful or because saving her would make him famous. Not because the calculus was easy or the outcome was guaranteed. But because somewhere in the long mathematics of courage and consequence, he had added it up and found that her life mattered. That peace mattered. That the kind of leader he was required him to carry both the weight of a nation and the weight of a single human being at the same time, without putting either one down. That is the story. And it deserves to be told.